Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Musical Innertube. I'm Don Rooney.
And I'm John Timpane. You know, Don's had quite a career in radio and television, where he's been an air personality, a news anchor, even a TV weatherman.
And John has been a college professor. He's written several books, and he's been an editor and features writer at the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper.
We first teamed up for a radio show in college. On one show, we introduced a soothing musical interlude.
But we stumbled, and it came out Musical Innertube.
And that became the name for this podcast, where we talk with interesting people about their interesting lives, difference makers who really make a difference. And today on the Musical Innertube, we are very happy to welcome Robert Thompson to our show. He is the founding director of the Bleier Center for Television and Popular Culture and a trustee professor of television and popular culture at Syracuse University. He's been all over the media all the time for as long as I can remember, the author of books and a real ambassador for understanding popular media. Today he is here with us to talk about how media is doing in covering the Ukraine war. Welcome to the Musical Innertube, Robert.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just start off by acknowledging that the war is everywhere on TV and on radio news and all over social media, which is something we should probably talk about as a separate issue here. But I'm just wondering, as you scan the TV coverage and the media coverage more generally that you see, what are some of the things that come to mind about how it's being covered?
Well, first of all, as you point out, it is everywhere. I mean, there are so many places in which one can see this news coverage in a way that has not always been the case in wars during the electronic media age. We've been covering wars, of course, for as long as we've had the means to do it, with film, with radio, with television. But the idea that we can have pretty much 24-hour coverage, not just on social media, of course, which has no sense of time limitations, but CNN is once again essentially become the war network. We see it. They'll every now and again have a little story of something else that's happening, but pretty much they go directly back to Ukraine. So that's different than, I think, of Vietnam, which was called the Living Room War. The first television war, which it wasn't. Korea was covered by television, sometimes very aptly, as a matter of fact. But Vietnam, it really was. There was that sense that the TV in the kitchen was showing bombings while we were, eating our meatloaf. Right. But now there is a sense that, it's everywhere all the time. And we can go back to CNN first got really good at this during the first Gulf War, which, of course, is before MSNBC or Fox was around. CNN pretty much had this to themselves. And that was a fairly short war, and the entire thing was covered 24 hours a day by CNN. So that's the first thing. There is a lot of this coverage out there. The other thing I think we're noticing here that we didn't, for example, in the Gulf War, or even so much in the Afghanistan war, is these lots and lots of up close and personal kinds of stories. Not just in the electronic media, but AP just yesterday had a heart-rending story out of Mariupol that covered kind of the real details of how individual human beings, our fellow citizens of the world, are being treated and what's happening to them, and all of that. So there really is a sense of up close and personal that we didn't get so much in the Gulf War, which was almost more Schwarzkopf showing these things that looked like they were video games. And of course, the other thing we get is just constant analysis. Before Zelensky's address to Congress, I think CNN had a checkerboard of maybe 8 different people on screen that were weighing in on what was going to be said, what had been said, and how people were responding to what had been said.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I watched that yesterday morning. It was a very moving speech. Zelensky is a a former entertainer, former comic, former television personality, and he knows how to
Former
work
winner of Ukraine's Dancing with the Stars, you forgot to mention.
Oh my gosh, that's true. He's a good dancer too, which really does help when you're leading a country in a war. And but seriously, seriously, what I was struck by was how CNN covered even the spin room after, they hung out with the senators and Congress people and interviewed them about what they were thinking, and there were people there from the Ukrainian embassy. They talked to them. That was quite amazing. I mean, Zelensky has emerged as really sort of the star, if you want. If this show has a star, a face that you can associate with it, Zelensky is it. And I think that to me is something new in war coverage. That there's one person. I guess you could say that Saddam Hussein was the one person we were talking about a lot during the second Gulf War, but there hasn't been a person like Zelensky before.
No, and I think that day of his speech is as good a place as any to start about a discussion of this coverage, because there was a lot going on in that day. First of all, as you point out, we really do have this personality who has become the face of Ukraine for obvious reasons. He's the president, but who really has emerged as a TV star, something that he's well trained to be. And even that we should probably talk about. You mentioned that he was a comedian at 25. He'd started his own production company. And I don't know if you've seen it yet, but Servant of the People, which played from 2015 to 2019, I think, 3 seasons, is really a charming and delightful series. I showed the first 2 episodes to my students last week. None of them had seen it before. And it is extraordinary how by the 3rd season of that, they had in fact registered a party called Servant of the People, named after the show. This would be if somebody registered the Game of Thrones party today. And not only did they register it, but they then managed to get Zelensky elected. He won by over 70% of the vote, which is actually 10% more than he wins fictionally in Servant of the People. And the very day that he gave his speech to Congress, to the U.S. Congress Wednesday, Netflix in the U.S. put Servant of the People back up on their service. It had been taken down for a while. So there is this parallel. Now let's look at that speech itself, which of course was a television event. That's what it was. It was a piece of television. The way he got on there, and of course it was being covered everywhere, including in a lot of markets, the networks, not just CNN, broke in to talk about it. And it was so brilliantly put together. Mentions of Martin Luther King, evocations of Pearl Harbor and 9/11. And then, of course, embedded in this speech at the end was a television show, a video put together, which of course was horrible and very moving and all of that. And then Zelensky comes back in a brilliant rhetorical flourish and does the rest of the speech in English, very good English, I might add, and addresses the president directly and speaks in this again just rhetorically so a brilliant way. And then it's over, and we go to the spin room, and we get the response. That was and I think will remain one of the big kind of TV coverage moments where we realize that in this age, and for quite some time now, war is every bit as much a television show as it is a set of military events going on in geographic space. One could argue that 9/11 was a TV show. It was designed to be covered, and it was done in a place where there's probably more cameras per capita than just about anywhere. And the idea that what's that old? If a tree falls in a forest, and nobody's there to hear it, does it really happen? The idea now that a war has got to be a television show, or there's a question of it if it even is a war.
There's a couple of parallels when we talk about Zelensky that come to my mind, and I'd like to address both of them. The first is Jon Stewart. When Jon Stewart was on the air in America, most people of a certain age turned to him to find out what the news was. And he constantly said, no, I'm a comedian. But indeed, his show was showing more about what was happening in politics in the country than a lot of the network news shows. So that's a parallel. The other parallel I like to explore is the fact that Zelensky won as a media personality the presidency, the same as Donald Trump. So, what parallels can we divine from these two situations?
Okay, both very, very rich and interesting. Let's start with Jon Stewart. We used to make fun. I remember we would hear these reports that a recent poll has come out, and you just pointed this out, that said that among from 13 to 25 get most of their news from late night comedy. What a state this country is in! Isn't that ridiculous? How is it that how can we ever take ourselves seriously if that's where we're getting our news? I don't think we were laughing at that after a little while, in that, of course, your only source of news shouldn't be a late night comedy show, but putting Jon Stewart in the rotation of the various sources that you get your news was not a bad idea. And I remember back then, remember so many people were afraid of being, including journalists, of being perceived as unpatriotic, as un-American. And remember, this is a time where people like Bill Maher were getting fired for saying things that were actually pretty reasonable. The Dixie Chicks, all of that kind of thing. And I think it was certainly not one of the greatest moments in American journalism when that whole start of that war was being covered and all the rest of it. And as you just said, Jon Stewart was going after Jon Stewart and company. He wasn't making it all up himself, but that show, The Daily Show, was going after that war maybe in a comic mode as opposed to a journalistic mode, but it was covering it and it was doing things in a comic mode that we wished we would have seen in a journalistic mode in other places, putting the clips together, showing the contradictions, all of that kind of thing. And it was during that period that I think American comedy, for the first time in a long, long time, really emerged as an important part of the civic conversation. Now, Jon Stewart was a comedian and he was doing important journalistic stuff in spite of his kind of faux humility. I think Jon Stewart knew and does know that he was doing something important, and he just gave us that, I'm just a basic cable show that follows a show about puppets or whatever. But I think he knew what was going on. So there we have a comedian. Now, Zelensky, it's true, has a comic background, but he's doing something now, of course, very different than what Jon Stewart was doing. He's not using comic skills or comic ways to talk about things that journalism may have a hard time. He is completely converted to the statesperson. You don't see him making or using any of his comic skills. Even when Nancy Pelosi, this was not a comfortable moment when she was introducing him when he gave his speech to Congress, and with that uncomfortable giggle she was doing and all the rest of it. He was having none of the lighter side of this. He is certainly demonstrating that there is no lighter side of this to him. So he has become something else. He used his showbiz skills very, very expertly in that address, but he certainly wasn't using comic skills. So that's the first point. As for the fact that both Zelensky and Donald Trump were very, very popular television personalities who ultimately ended up getting elected to be the chief officers of their respective nations. That is true. Both of them were that. But I think there are a lot of other comparisons we could make that would be very, very different ones. though Donald Trump certainly did learn show business in his work on television. I think a lot less with The Apprentice. People talk about how The Apprentice is what made Donald Trump and got him to be president. I think a lot less influential than The Apprentice was the work he did with wrestling, in professional wrestling, all those Battle of the Billionaires things that he was doing with Vince McMahon. If you go back and look at that stuff, that's where he learned his rhetorical style. I think he got a really strong taste for talking to that demographic of people in a live sort of setting with that call and response kind of thing. You can see in the work he did in professional wrestling, dress rehearsals for his rallies. They are very, very similar. He is working all of that out. So in that sense, I guess it's true. Both Zelensky and Donald Trump learned how to speak to an audience through the work they did on television, where that's exactly what you did. But in many, many ways, they are, of course, two very, very, very different people with two very, very different approaches.
Well, part of the drama of watching Zelensky is knowing that he has, crosshairs on his back. That here's a man whose life is in danger, and whose whole, not just his leadership of a country, but the fact that they're going to try and take him out, or it seems like they would be happy to. The other side, he's hunkering down in bunkers. Making broadcasts with a background so you don't know where he is. Here's a man really in hiding, trying to run a war defense effort, which seems to have been very successful so far, but also trying to reach out to the rest of the world. I don't know that I've seen something like that before. A person who's in real time, while he's talking to me, the television consumer, is fighting for his life. Really.
On the other hand, though, John, I know he has tried to cut off Russian suggestions that he had left Kyiv, because I remember him doing a walk and talk through the government, house as he was headed toward his desk for one of his speeches. So I think he's also trying to show that he's still with the people, even though you're right, he's trying to dodge hitmen or snipers or whatever.
No, you're right. Yes, a lot of times he is talking in what appears to be an undisclosed location. But unlike Saddam Hussein or bin Laden, who, there was this idea that we were getting communications from them, but we didn't know what cave they were in. Yes. Zelensky, in fact, is making relatively frequent appearances in front of identifiable geographic space, and it is really scary. Now, of course, we've had back to the beginning of electronic media, things that could be comparable, though they are very different. I'm thinking about FDR, who learned very quickly how this new mass medium of radio, which goes right into the homes of the people that are listening to it, how effective that could be. Now, of course, FDR was in the United States, which, with the exception of Pearl Harbor, wasn't being bombed at the time. But he learned, he was doing those fireside chats long before the war, talking about the Depression, how economics work, how we have to get out of it, and all the rest of it. So the idea of talking directly to people, not just in war in the case of FDR, but even before that, through this intimate medium, in that case of radio, goes back a long time. And I suppose we can see in some of those fireside chats of FDR some of the early tendencies that Zelensky is talking about. As I recall, FDR had his dog present with him when he was talking on the radio. And there is that intimacy of Zelensky, the way he's dressed, the way he's growing his beard, all of that kind of thing. And as you just said, the way he is talking directly to us.
Let's talk about the coverage of the war on television. What are the good and bad consequences of having cameras to show what's going on the ground? It's become even more, I think, than the war action that we saw in Afghanistan, where we would see, occasional forays into the hills and that sort of thing. But really, seeing bombings in cities in Ukraine and seeing buildings being blown apart is a very regular part of the coverage. How effective is that? And what are the pluses and minuses of having crews on the ground during a war like that?
Well, it's certainly effective insofar as it's showing us what is happening, because we are actually seeing this this stuff. And you're right. I think we're seeing a lot more of it than we were in Afghanistan or the Gulf Wars either. And there's differences there in that I remember those Schwarzkopf press conferences and things where we would get those video game like things of a target. It'd usually be in black and white, taken from a plane or whatever, and then it would hit. We'd show how one of these targets had been hit. But those were specific military targets. There was an almost abstraction about that. What we're seeing now are these civilian targets, the theaters and the hospitals and all of this kind of thing being hit, which of course gives a very strong emotional response. We have that kind of intimacy. We did have in Vietnam. We had a lot of reporters. I think of Morley Safer's famous, what they called the Zippo lighter story, where U.S. military had come in and were burning these grass shacks in Cam Knee, I think was the village. That was very effective and went a long way, I think, in giving a lot of voltage to the anti-war movement at the time. So we've seen some of that before, but we're seeing a lot of it now. Advantages and disadvantages as this gets so complicated. I mean, I guess the advantage, of course, is it does allow us to bear witness to what is happening. The most recent, I think, an obvious comparison one could make would be the George Floyd video and all of the other videos that we've seen of similar kinds of events. It's not as though those kinds of things haven't been happening for a long time, but with the ability of portable, very portable means of gathering video and all the rest of it, we now have people who are bearing witness to it. We see it, and something is done about it. This goes back maybe to the Rodney King beating video, which was done, I think, with a big camcorder as opposed to a phone. So having this evidence of what is happening is just that, evidence, and I think that's a good thing. It is strange in that we've got, unlike 9/11, where all the commercials and all the regular programming was completely thrown away and we got straight coverage. I've got CNN on in the background as I'm speaking to you. And, I'll look up in 1 second and I'll see the replay of a civilian target being bombed and exploding and the top floors disintegrating. And then I'll look up a minute later and there'll be an Allegra commercial going on.
Yes.
That is really kind of strange. We got that obviously in Vietnam War coverage. Sure. There'd be the news and there'd be ads and everything. But there is this odd sense that we are seeing a very, very frightening, horrible thing happening in real time and then being played back over and over again. and then business as usual is continuing to go on. There's a dissonance about that, which I don't think there's anything we can do about it. Someone's got to pay all those people on the ground reporting this. But it's very weird is the only word I can think of.
Yeah. There is a very famous clip I've seen a number of times when CNN's coverage first started of a dual box on the screen. And in one box, it's an overview of a Ukrainian city getting attacked. And in the other box, it's an Applebee's commercial.
Yeah, it's like what they do with soccer, where they don't interrupt the game for the commercials. They just run the commercial while the game is being played, which, of course, I hate as a fan. But I saw that too, Don. I saw that was what they were going to.
And you know who's talking about where I first saw that Applebee's thing? I didn't see that particular moment of coverage live, but I saw it a lot of times in where else but the late night comedies, which of course have been covering that.
Kimmel and Colbert.
Right,
I remember
they're all dealing with that. So there's that. The other thing, of course, and this is also very complicated, that as opposed to the times when we would get Walter Cronkite would give his coverage on the evening news, and then there'd be an occasional news special during the Vietnam era. We were getting a lot of TV coverage of that, and a lot of very, very good TV coverage of that as well. But the 24-hour news environment has allowed us, of course, to have this not unlimited time, but lots and lots of time for these expert discussions, which are really getting into the whole, idea of, well, what Biden's thinking about this is he can't say this because Putin will think this. The idea of laying all the, it's almost like, having the strategy meetings reported. There's always a question about whether that what kind of thing that could actually be effect that could be having on responses that people are having, especially with all this speculation about if we do this, this, or this, then there's World War III, and that that kind of coverage becomes kind of test cases, feeling of the water, of course, for someone like Putin, who's kind of seeing how that all goes down. When I was a kid, I was born in 1959, so I grew up in a time that was really scary with regards to the Cold War. I was, 3 or 4 when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. Mm-hmm. And as a kid, I used to have nuclear horrible dreams all the time. And those went away a long time ago. And 2 nights ago, I had my first nuclear dream again. And that was, I don't think I'm probably alone in that.
I don't think hiding underneath desks is going to work.
No.
Yes, the duck and cover thing.
Duck and cover, yes.
Now something that an animated turtle might do, but it's not going to do us any good.
Yeah. I don't know if Don's school had this, but Immaculate Heart of Mary had a concrete bunker underneath the vestibule of the church that was connected with our school. And we had a regular drill where we would get up and march across the blacktop to the underground bunker, and we get down inside, and we looked at all the shelves that had huge cans, the largest cans, by the way, Robert, of baked beans I had ever seen in my life. That's the way people were. This was Kennedy era stuff, and I was walking the dog 2 nights ago when I suddenly had just a taste of nuclear anxiety. I thought, gosh, what if he does make it nuclear? What if he uses nuclear devices in Ukraine? Because right now the bombing, I think, is going very well for him. He could just go to his Syrian approach and just level, cities, no matter how long it takes, rather than expending infantry lives. But what if it gets so bad that he decides, well, the only way to do this is a nuclear bomb? I mean, it did suddenly creep right in there.
And that speculation, we're talking about it right now in public, and it's being talked about endlessly on CNN and all of the other news outlets, which, I mean, we can't not talk about it. It's probably the central issue in what's happening right now. But that brings in all kinds of complications and all the rest of it, our personal anxieties being the least of those.
We'll have more with Robert Thompson in just a moment. But first, this soothing musical Innertube.
Prior to his position at Syracuse University, Robert Thompson was a visiting professor for 6 summers at Cornell University, and he served for 9 years as professor and director of the NHSI Television and Film Institute at Northwestern University.
Robert is the general editor of an ongoing series of books about television published by Syracuse University Press. He is the former president of the National Popular Culture Association and lectures across the country on the subject of television and popular culture.
Robert Thompson is the author or editor of 4 books: Television's Second Golden Age, Prime Time, Prime Movers, Adventures on Prime Time, and Television Studies.
For more info, check out Robert Thompson's webpage at newhouse.syr.edu/people/Robert-Thompson. That's THOMPSON. And now, more of the musical Innertube.
What about the media in Russia? From what I've seen, they're being fed, obviously, whatever Putin wants them to hear. But then we have that one woman who stood up in the middle of a nightly newscast with a big banner that said, "Stop the war." And apparently she's still alive and still around, but I wouldn't think that she would feel real comfortable at this point. What do you hear about Russian media? And I know that one independent station walked off in the middle of a broadcast as they were being shut down.
Right.
Are we seeing any more independent voices, or are we likely to see any more independent voices coming out of Russia?
Well, I think a few of those, and you're right. I would have hated to have been her in the HR meeting that happened after that event. But I think we'll see, some of these isolated events. But that's the discouraging thing is the hope one has as we watch this coverage is that as any human being sees what's going on and both watches and reads and sees the pictures of some of these things that human support for this could not possibly endure. But the discouraging thing is when you've, of course, blocked off all of that information. The idea that we're thinking, if everybody in Russia is seeing this coverage, then, eventually this is going to have to stop. But the fact is they are not seeing this coverage. So all of that information, or so much of that information, isn't getting through. And we've seen in our own culture how people can become very, very convinced of stuff that is clearly wrong. The whole disinformation, fake reports and all of that kind of thing. It happens here. There's no reason to expect that it wouldn't happen there, especially when that information is being controlled at such an extreme level.
I want to talk about the fact that there probably in our lifetimes has not been a war that seemed where it seems so clear who the bad guy and who the good guy was. And this has people have mentioned it to me that the news coverage here in the United States is I think 100% pro-Ukrainian. And I'm not talking now about the facts of the matter, because it seems to me, of course, that this was a war of choice by Vladimir Putin. I understand that there is a Russian viewpoint about Ukraine, that many Russians have always lived in a world where Ukraine was part of Russia. And then when something was wrong when it declared independence or was granted its independence. And I'm wondering, what do you think about the fact that it is so heavily pro-Ukrainian,
except for Tucker Carlson. Right?
Yes, he's
right. I was going to bring that up. That it's certainly not exclusive. And over there, where Tucker works, it is really complicated. The dance that is being done there that you can watch every now and again
on Fox, sure,
popping up. Yeah, but you're right. I don't think there was a sense, and this has been been said before, and I don't mean to say that there's any such thing as a good war, but people have often said the Second World War was the last good war, where you really had a set of antagonists who had been so aggressively on what I think almost any rational person would say the bad guy side,
Right.
and that needed to be stopped. And the idea that we got into that war too late, as opposed to that we shouldn't have gotten into it at all. So I think that really was that sense, to the extent that we are still nostalgic for that war and continue to make Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan and all of that, remembering when there was kind of a real moral imperative and justification for those military actions. Since then, of course, we look Korea, a very ambiguous conflict. Vietnam, ultimately, we left based on our own internal protests about it. All of the Middle East conflicts and everything, all of the unofficial conflicts, all of them have been fraught with really complicated politics and a lot of people being on the side of protest against those sort of things, right up to this Ukrainian war. Now, I think you're right. Most of this coverage is pro-Ukrainian. And as you point out, one of the reasons for that is that it does really seem to be so clear in this coverage that there is a protagonist and an antagonist that is so much more clear than all of the other military conflicts that we've had since the Second World War. Is that impacting the just the facts, ma'am, kind of coverage that journalists really should be and need to be doing in a healthy information environment? I suppose it is to some extent. I think there, especially in these first 3 weeks, we are not getting a lot of stories that are saying, and now the background of, what the Soviet Union was and how some feel that this destruction. I mean, we're not getting a lot of those stories. I'm sure they are out there, but now in these first, the attacks, the casualties are so overwhelming that's what is getting most of the coverage, of course.
Yeah, and let's talk also about the fact that we've had a couple of journalists killed in this war, and that has been brought to our attention. I'm thinking much more that there have been journalists killed in other wars, especially in some of the Middle Eastern conflicts, but the thing that strikes me as unusual is the fact that these journalists have been killed, I want to say almost at random. I know one of them was shot at a checkpoint, but I think a photographer was killed when a building was hit with a bomb. So we're seeing journalists put at some risk and seeing the consequences of that for the first time in a long time.
Yeah, I think a lot of journalists have been at risk as long as there have been journalists. I think it is completely appropriate that we say to soldiers, thank you for your service. I think it is every bit as appropriate that we say to journalists, thank you for your service, because journalists, of course, are a crucial part of the health of any republic like ours. And as we're seeing, that is a dangerous job, and we're seeing casualties among that population.
Well, I remember there have been in Vietnam, I guess, almost 70 journalists were killed, and I remember, I think it was Joe Galloway who got a Purple Heart for helping get men and bodies out of the way in Nha Trang. You got to, and there's a lot. I remember Bernie Shaw sort of reporting from the hotel
Right.
during the bombing of Baghdad in, what was it, 91 or whatever it was. And there, part of the drama was the danger to him and the rest of the CNN crew. At that point, that kind of reporting was very novel, that this was the start of the war, that we were watching it. That was the first time I'd ever seen anything like that. It was almost like somebody had blown a whistle, and it's like the beginning of a soccer game, and suddenly the bombs started lighting up the sky.
That's a creepy but very appropriate comparison. There was a sense, Vietnam, we kind of got in gradually, and then we started seeing these reporters reporting sometimes right in battles themselves. Bombs are bursting in air while they're speaking to the microphone. But you're right, that war really was a sense, and I remember those Bernie Shaw reports better than anything of any of the coverage during that entire conflict. But there really was an odd, macabre sense that the coin had been flipped, the teams had been introduced, and now the thing is going to start. It had that, again, I'll say televised event sort of feel to it.
I wonder too if packaging for war, right? Media packaging for war gets too slick. Whether it's doing, there's always the sense that it might be distancing us from the events rather than bringing us into them.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, I think that's true. We're not getting, we're seeing raw footage, but it is, there's a crawl on the bottom. There's a breaking news banner. There's an identification of where it's from. Almost all of these, in the very literal sense of the word, mediated things that automatically distance us from, we're not just looking at this through some security camera. We're seeing it through a whole set of mediations, from the graphics to the literal theme music, and of course all the boxes of the other people that are commenting upon it. I'm not sure exactly what, I suppose in the best of all possible worlds, I think some of this slickness is probably, if nothing else, in kind of bad taste. And maybe if I were in charge, I would take away. At the same time, I don't think we can get away from the fact that this is mediated. All of this stuff is happening many, many miles away, and we are consuming it oftentimes in our living rooms, in our pajamas, or waiting for our car on our cell phones. And there is going to be a sense of distancing and decontextualizing that's going to occur. A lot of people, one could argue that some of the stuff that you could watch that's the least mediated may be the stuff on social media, some of these TikTok posts and stuff that are completely, but those aren't unmediated. They are in fact, because they're up against and next to all of this other stuff on TikTok, all of that is diluting and changing it as well. I had a reporter call me about the coverage of this war, and she told me that her 13-year-old child was looking at all the coverage of this war on TikTok. And then the child heard NPR that mom was listening to and said, "How do you listen to this? This is really scary. This is really upsetting."
Yeah.
Now, I think that speaks volumes in that you get some of this quote unquote unmediated stuff that you can get on TikTok and other social media. And then when listening to the radio report, which, by the way, no pictures, very mediated, was what this child or 13-year-old perceived as the more upsetting. I'm not sure what to make of that, but I think that's really interesting.
Well, of course, radio sort of leaves it up to you to create the pictures in your head. And psychologically, I think, and sometimes at certain points, radio, of course, I'm a big fan of 1930s and 40s radio serials for this reason, that radio is an especially intimate source of entertainment, because you have to your brain is enlisted in, in making the show, so to speak. I can, that's sort of interesting. We're sort of talking about the different ways the media work here. And
I'm glad you brought up 30s and 40s radio, and I'm going to tell this as quickly as I can, but I think it might even be relevant. There was a one of these series called Suspense back. If you're a 30s,
Absolutely.
40s radio, you know it well.
Yeah.
And there was this monster or something that when you made eye contact, kind of Medusa type of thing, it would turn you inside out. And can you imagine if you did that on television with pictures, how much the special effects would be? And even how would you do it? Where do you start to turn somebody inside out? Because we're not like a paper bag sort of thing. Anyway, the way they did the special effect was they got somebody to put this big, long rubber glove that went up past the elbow, and they stuck it into a bucket, as I'm told, of a sort of oily thing. And then whenever they needed a human to turn inside out, they would slowly peel it off, almost like a stripper. So it would go, and then it would pop at the end when you were fully inside out. Now, I bring that up because there's a sense that if you were listening to that on radio, that was so appallingly graphic because you were hearing the sound and your brain was probably providing even more grotesque, specifics than the pictures had. And there may be a sense in good radio reporting that intimacy and that letting you do all of the work. I'm thinking of Edward R. Murrow's just chilling reports when he went in with the American troops to the Nazi prison camps.
Yes.
And he would just describe what he was seeing. And I compare that to the later footage we saw of that. And while both of those are just unthinkably horrible, there was a sense that some of those radio reports almost invited you to go. I don't know how you could go further than those pictures, but provided you with a real sense of horror because you weren't actually seeing it. It was all happening internally. So there is, I think, it's useful to discuss that different media have an impact on how we perceive these things. If you're watching the war on TikTok, if you're watching it on television, if you're listening to it on radio, those are different things, and they can have an impact on how you process that information.
And I think also watching the bombing of a city on television, whereas it's very gross and very violent and very real, on the same side of the coin, or the flip side of the coin, I guess, that has been done fictionally in movies and television for years. So maybe it doesn't hold the impact that it would if you hadn't seen movies of war for so long, or television shows where buildings were blown up.
That's a really interesting point. I hadn't really thought of that, but the idea that all of this footage that we're seeing, we're so familiar with. It's part of a visual vocabulary that we've all seen since we were little kids, and that in itself may have a distancing feature, which is why I know for me. And I think for many other people, this is the case. Of all the things I've seen so far of this coverage, and we've seen plenty of buildings blowing up, and we've seen bodies being put into trenches. I mean, we've no lack of the heart of darkness in this whole thing. But to me, still, the most haunting thing is, remember several days ago, there was that little kid walking down the street unaccompanied, weeping. And
yes.
that image was so, and I know they've later given us context or whatever. It's in and of itself, that was an unimportant image. It was a single individual. It was not on a journalistic level significant. But those kinds of images, which coverage of this can bring out are the ones that I think they transcend politics, they transcend history, they transcend everything and go deep into a, what do they call it, reptile brain sense of seeing a child alone weeping like that. Trumps kind of every other bit of journalistic reporting and information, and just becomes independently awful and independently sad.
I think this is the first time I'm trying to think of another time when we have covered a war that we were not involved in, but nevertheless was being taken largely, at least in this country, as a proxy war. The war of liberty versus authoritarian government, and watched it play out in such detail. And it seems as though there's a lot of different reasons that this is chilling, because if Russia, the argument is if Russia takes Ukraine over, what about Latvia? What about the next countries, further east, right? Is this the beginning of a major push? And I just think that sort of lends it a very sort of chilling, the fact that this is a symbol almost of a clash that we thought maybe had been put to rest, or at least was quiescent at the moment. This might be returning to our notion of nuclear anxiety.
Oh, I think very much so. In my history of TV class not long ago, we just covered the late 80s and showed coverage of the Berlin Wall coming down. And the way that was covered, of course, was this elation, the idea that the Cold War was finally over, that, we could finally quit making those practice marches to the concrete bunker and all that kind of thing. There really was a sense of almost giddiness in some of the reportage there. And then, of course, we did go into that period of the 1990s, which was this decade where immediate nuclear anxiety seemed to have dispersed, and terrorism anxiety had not kicked in yet. Right. And there was that almost sigh of immediate danger. You point out that you don't remember seeing anything involved in a war, or this kind of coverage wall to wall in a war that we're not specifically involved with. But then I think you answered that question by saying, I mean, you're right. I don't think we have, but it's because we are involved with this. Exactly. If this were simply two, non-nuclear nations doing terrible things to each other, or a non-nuclear nation doing terrible things to its neighbor, where there wasn't this sense of the implications that what could have, you can bet we wouldn't be covering it. And by the way, there are a lot of conflicts that we haven't covered that fall into that category.
Robert Thompson, you have been so wonderful and so patient, and you've taken us down so many paths to understanding media coverage of the Russia-Ukrainian conflict. We really, really have enjoyed this very illuminating hour of discussion. I want to thank you.
Thank you for talking about this very disturbing event with me.
Thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
You can get in touch with us by email. We're at musicalinnertube, all one word, @gmail.com.
You can also follow us on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @MInnertube. Capitalize the M and I.
Our webpage is Musical Innertube. That's musical spelled with two A's, .libsyn, that's spelled LIBSYN.com.
The Innertube is available on Amazon Music, Audible, Facebook, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio Podcasts, and anywhere that you get your podcasts. Like us and give us a good review on any of those platforms.
And as always, thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for our theme music.